everyone, welcome to Anthodish, the weekly show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Sarah Dugnan. This week on Anthodish, I'm interviewing Lindsay Grenier. Lindsay did her master's research as part of the Mothers to Baby study, which is a long-term study on maternal nutritional health through McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. She currently works as a researcher at McMaster, where she focuses on maternal health and nutrition. Her research interests more broadly revolve around women's health and social issues, particularly during pregnancy, along with health literacy, knowledge translation, and social determinants of health. Today we discuss food guidelines and taboos for pregnant people in Canada. We explore the ways in which social and biological factors shape access to nutritional knowledge during pregnancy, the role that knowledge translation plays for prenatal health and nutrition research, and how cultural belief systems impact the attitudes and behaviours surrounding food consumption and avoidance during pregnancy. Access to food and the social and cultural implications of this during pregnancy is a topic that I've been very passionate about, particularly as a young mother who, when I was pregnant, was working at a restaurant, living paycheck to paycheck, and definitely had to hustle to make ends meet. So I'm very excited to share this in the hopes that it raises some awareness about the limitations and the barriers that some people face during their pregnancies. All right, enjoy the episode. How are you doing today, Lindsay?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Pretty good. Thanks so much for joining me on Anthodish.
Not a problem. Happy to be here.
So let's start off by talking a little bit about who you are. So can you tell us who you are, where you're working right now, and the focus of your master's research project?
Yeah, for sure. So I did my undergrad at the University of Guelph, and that's where I live now. It was a Bachelor of Science degree in health science, and then I did my minor in anthro. After that, I went to McMaster, which is where I met you because we were office mates.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I did Master's of Anthropology and medical anthro. So that was kind of melding those two things together, which was ideal for me. Like I really liked the health aspect, but then I did also like the kind of cultural anthropological lens of healthcare and the medical field. So I completed my master's there, and I'll get into, I guess, about what my work was. I guess I can do that now. I basically did my thesis on a survey where we surveyed pregnant women in Hamilton and basically looked at their knowledge of health in regards to pregnancy, healthy eating, exercise, their thoughts and opinions regarding some kind of myths, if you will, like whether they thought these things were fact or fiction. For example, you should be eating for two. So that was, in a nutshell, my master's. And now I work at McMaster. I am a research assistant in the McMaster Midwifery Research Center.
Nice.
Doing research there with midwives. So that's really exciting. And I've been there for about a year now.
That's so cool. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. It's I really, really enjoy it. Like it was almost too good to be true, like in terms of the fit from my master's work. So it's honestly just like living the dream.
Okay, so I want to back up a little bit just before we dig into some of the research that you do. So for people who aren't familiar with medical anthropology, what sorts of, I guess, like how would you go about looking at health through a med-anth lens, like in terms of methodologies or just like the perspective that you bring to a health situation?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess the easiest way of explaining it is that you look at the health of people, the healthcare system as a whole, not from a medical perspective per se. So you're not looking at a person who has a disease, like you're not just looking at the how of the disease. Because like we know how diabetes works, for example, we know how people develop it or are born with it. So we understand the pathology of that disease. But what MedAnth tries to look at is what other factors are there? What other factors in that person's life? What other factors are there in that person's culture or in just society in general that impact either that person's disease or their health or whether or not they can actually access healthcare? So it's kind of all these other factors. So they kind of call that social determinants of health is what they kind of call that in the MedAnth realm. But basically looking at looking at health and medicine in a much broader sense.
I like the distinction that you had about it's not the how of the disease, because I've actually never really looked at it that way from my own research. So I think that's super like a quick, useful way of looking at it.
Yeah, because I mean, I have friends who are doctors who are in med school, and to them, they don't necessarily look at it that way. They think like, oh, this person had really bad habits, or this person
Mm-hmm.
um, did these things that caused this illness or caused this disease. And maybe in some ways, like that person maybe has some like responsibility or personal agency, but like in so many cases, like you can look at like the broader things of that person's life and that person's like society and culture that you can kind of point to and say, okay, but they were predisposed because of these other issues that they didn't have control over.
Right. And it's thinking more broadly from the personal too. So looking at community and also like intergenerational impacts and the lasting effect of that as well, right?
Exactly. Like we live in a socialized healthcare system in Canada, and yet it is very much still like individual responsibility. Like you got that disease, or
Mm-hmm.
you became obese and had a heart attack, so that's on you. And so it's interesting that like the onus is put on the person, yet the responsibility is very much like not shared
Yeah. Yeah.
in terms of like how our society is set up and just kind of like the culture of how we all just live our daily lives.
Very much so. That's very poignant. Okay, so let's move into some of the stuff that you've been working on in your master's, and now because I'm like so fascinated by this topic, and I'm sure both of us could talk about it forever. Um, so, what is the current food and nutrition guidelines for pregnancy in Canada right now? And have they changed a lot recently, or have they kind of stayed the same through time?
So the guidelines right now, without getting into like the nitty gritty of like what they are, they very much revolve around gestational weight gain. So on, if you go to the Health Canada website, they have like a little calculator, so you can put in your BMI, and it'll kind of give you the range that you should be gaining in based on your BMI. Um, so they look at gestational weight gain, which is how much you should be gaining at various points throughout your pregnancy. They look at supplements. So folic acid is a big one, like vitamin D, that sort of thing. They also look at the category of like food safety. So you should avoid soft cheeses, and you should avoid like fish and sushi and those types of things. So
Right.
it's honestly kind of vague in some senses, because they're basically they direct you to look at the healthy eating guide for Canada, like the food pyramid, right? Or I guess now it's like the plate with the different portions on it. But
Yeah, I forgot it changed. Yeah.
so yeah, that changed, I guess. Um, so yeah, they really direct women to kind of go there, and so it's like, okay, you should be eating a normal healthy diet, which does make sense.
Hmm.
Um, but it's interesting because, and this is something we found from my master's research, but the guidelines are they're vague, and they don't give a lot of explanation. So they say like, okay, avoid fish, avoid undercooked meat, avoid soft cheeses. Like they have all these, they have lists of things that you should not be eating, but they don't necessarily give you a good explanation. And they have been changing quite a bit, especially the gestational weight gain guidelines. I think I even read a paper the other day saying that new evidence from this study had basically said, okay, we need to relook at this again, because they have been changing it, where I think they've been reducing the additional like servings and calories that that women should be eating. Because again, the whole eating for two thing, like I think they were
Right.
kind of skewed to eating more versus eating less. And now, as they have more evidence, they're kind of saying, well, no, like you really don't need that much more. Like you don't need an extra serving of food. Like it's really only like an extra snack, or like I think I might be wrong on the exact numbers here, but I think something between like your second and third trimester, you only really need like an extra 300 calories, which is like a
Yeah.
snack.
Yeah, and that's I remember when I was pregnant, they had like those charts, and
Mhm.
I was actually really surprised because I remember like during the third trimester, I think it was something like you could just add they would give you the examples and it would just be like, oh, you could just add, a snack of cottage cheese and you're meeting your nutritional demands for third trimester, which,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, in your mind, you're like, oh, but that doesn't seem like that's that much food to eat when you're at the tail end of pregnancy.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, they do have these little charts on the website where it shows you like examples. And some of them are good and some of them like aren't great. Because again, if you're looking at like um people who don't necessarily have a lot of money or people who aren't necessarily very educated, like like I saw a couple of them and it's like in grams or like it's measured in like 3/4
Yeah.
cups and stuff. It's like that's not necessarily like a good measurement for people who, do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
an apple is a unit of measurement. Like if you say like eat like one extra apple a day and you're fine, like that's very different than like eat 200 grams of cottage cheese.
Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
no one knows what that is.
No, like I couldn't even answer that. And I'd probably put way more than it was actually supposed to.
Yeah, exactly.
So like having that visual. Yeah.
Yeah, it's and just in general, like the food guide itself is not as evidence based as it should be or could be. Not as evidence based as everyone thinks it is. Yeah, it's like especially if you look at the changes over time, right? Like you can see like way back in the day when it was like big dairy instead of big pharma, it was like okay, like the dairy intake was like enormous, and so it has changed over time too, with like the interest groups kind of having a say in things, like the grain farmers of Canada and like the meat industry and eggs and all that sort of stuff, right? So all
Yeah.
these things come in and out of vogue based on um, like eggs are the devil. Now eggs are good for you. They're probably going to be bad for you again in 2 years. So there's a lot of changes and fluctuations that way that don't have anything to do with pregnancy, but do impact them because basically their guidelines are to follow the regular food guide.
Right. So let's go back to that idea a little bit. In terms of the foundations for the Canada Food Guide, and even within, or to take that a step further, I guess, the foundations for pregnancy food guidelines in Canada, who kind of has that say, or like who started that guideline, and what sorts of studies or research has helped shape those over time?
I mean, it is definitely based in studies, but I think not to sound too like conspiracy theory-ish, but I mean, if you, like I said, like the whole things coming in and out of vogue, like there is evidence for the things that are on there.
Hmm.
But if you look over time, like there was evidence that the cholesterol in eggs was bad for you.
Yeah.
That existed, right? So like there was data saying that, but now we have different data, maybe with like better studies or more sound studies that say no, they're good in like moderation, right? So it's hard to say like that the data isn't there because it is, but I think it's just one of those things that like as we go, like we learn more and more about nutrition and how things are metabolized in our bodies a lot better. Um, so yeah, I mean, there is lots of evidence for it in the literature, and there's more and more every day, which is hopefully why it's getting better. Like there have been
Yeah.
changes, and I think that's great. In terms of like the pregnancy guidelines, I think basically they're very much just based off of the regular guidelines. And then again, like kind of how they found out that these things weren't safe. So, for example, um, one of the things that people should avoid, according to the food guide, is processed meats, so lunch meats.
Right.
And the reason for that is because of food contamination. And the reason why pregnant women shouldn't eat that is because they have less of an immunity and are more at risk if they were to contract something than someone who wasn't pregnant.
Right.
So it's like the additions of like what you should and shouldn't do kind of come about based on like evidence of safety.
Right. So it's more in reaction to like negative evidence, right?
I mean, that's my understanding of it. That's how that's from the literature that I've read at least. Because even if you look at the alcohol piece as well, it still says like 0 levels of alcohol are safe. But you look at other countries and based on evidence, they're like, okay, certain amounts, I think it's like a 4-ounce glass within certain periods after a certain developmental stage in your pregnancy like once a day or like once a week is acceptable.
Right.
And so that's part of their guidelines. So it's partly about safety, but it's also partly about the acceptability of that thing in your culture.
Yeah, and I think you hit a good point with that too, because I find within our culture, I mean, there's prohibition for so long, and that really shaped how we deal with alcohol in Canada and the US. And then you also have, as you mentioned, you had like dairy lobbyists or grain lobbyists influencing what got attention as well through time. So it was like that combination of evidence, but also financial support for different messages or cultural support for different farming groups as well, right?
So yeah, I think it's one of those things like I mean I have no idea. I am just completely guessing on this one. But if you go to a country like Japan where sushi and raw fish is a huge part of their food system,
Yeah.
I don't know this for a fact, but I would find it very difficult to believe that anytime a woman gets pregnant, they cut out a major aspect of their food groups.
Right, that would be a total dietary shift that would be
Right? That would be massive. Like
yeah.
we cut out there's very little that we consider unsafe in terms of like North American standards, but like that would be a huge piece of their like daily intake that they would have to be modifying. Like that would be
Mhm.
massive.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's interesting how, um, the guidelines are very much shaped by the cultural attitudes and practices around food.
Like if you go back to the egg thing, my example that I keep going back to, the reason why it kind of goes back and forth is because at the time, cholesterol was the devil. Like it
Mhm.
wasn't that eggs were the devil, but it was the cholesterol in the eggs. And so now the thing that we focus on is sugars and carbs.
Yeah.
So no, those are the things that we're demonizing. And so it's interesting because like it's hard because it as a as a governmental agency, they can't just say everything in moderation, just eat a balanced, healthy lifestyle because most people don't know what that is. Like most highly educated people, if you were to ask them like what does the like Health Canada food guide look like or can you give me an example of like what a healthy meal would be? Like even really educated people really don't know because the guidelines do change a lot and it's one of those things that like they don't really follow it that closely, I think.
No, and, like, you have a basic sense of it, but if you think even the amount like, the sheer amount of food that the food guidelines suggest for daily intakes, to me, has always been, like, crazy, like, too much.
Mhm.
And you'd have to be, like, eating and preparing food all day to hit those, so even when you think about that as a nutritional researcher, and the feasibility of, like, the time and effort and money that go into that, that's also a big factor.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point to add to that.
All right. So let's kind of shift gears a little bit. So, a term that we use a lot in academia, I find, is the term knowledge translation. So, when you're thinking about it in terms of prenatal nutrition for pregnant women, what do you kind of envision that term as, and how would you practice it within your field?
So I have to preface this by saying that knowledge translation is a huge buzzword, and I thought it was just one of those empty buzzwords.
Yeah.
But after doing all of this, it really is so important. It's one of those, it's the idea of taking research. So we go out, we do our field work, or we do our interviews and our surveys and whatnot, and we write up our manuscripts and we hopefully get them published in an academic journal or somewhere. And knowledge translation is supposed to be that kind of final step where you do something with it. So you
Hmm.
take that new knowledge that you have created, and if it's in epidemiology or if it's in meta-anth, like you maybe try and make some policy changes or some practice changes. So maybe you want to like petition your local government to try and make some sort of change based on this evidence. And it is one of those new buzzwords that everyone kind of throws around, but I can't even tell you the amount of studies I've read and just even from my own masters where it's like we get this great data and we identify these problems. We don't necessarily find the solutions, but we find a problem and then we publish our article and then it basically just lives in the academic sphere and then nothing happens to it.
Yeah.
So knowledge translation is basically taking that new knowledge out of the academic sphere and actually doing something with it.
So taking it that next step.
Yeah, so taking it and translating it out of like academic jargon and mumbo jumbo and making it in a way that like you can do something with it, and then normal people can actually understand what it is and what you're trying to say and what you're trying to do.
Perfect. Okay. And that makes, like, to me, that makes so much sense. But I've always been, as you said, like when you were first starting out, a little skeptical of how realistic it is in some instances. So thinking about within your own work, how have you found knowledge translation is practiced within like prenatal nutrition?
I think people are trying, but I think it's really hard to change long-standing beliefs and long-standing traditions and whatnot.
Yeah.
Like I know in the work that I'm doing now, particularly with midwives, they're very, I don't want to say like activists, but they are very engaged and very involved in not only doing research but bringing that back into the practice. So I find that they are trying very hard to make knowledge translation a part of their project. So there is like a knowledge translation part of their project that has been funded. So like that's part of where the funding is going to, is trying to make pamphlets or posters or something, right?
Right.
But I don't know what the state is in other pieces of research. I know for my master's, it's like I'm still trying to kind of get my manuscript going and publish it. But even then, if I get it published in an academic journal, I don't know where else we would go with that information,
Yeah.
because the healthcare system is so big that like to get any sort of change, it has to come from the top.
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't know how, like, because I've never actually gone through it, I don't know how receptive they are to this kind of research, um, to basically say, hey, you're doing this badly, or you could be doing this better. I don't know how receptive they are to issues that to medanth and to kind of the social determinants of health is a major problem, but not might not be a problem to them in the grand scheme of things in terms of priorities.
Yeah, particularly if their priorities is, focus more on like the physical health of the individual pregnant woman and their child. Um, and as you said, like having that, like it's the difference of, having one journal article that has certain information about the social determinants influencing nutritional health, versus, years and years and years of research from a big project that can kind of point to this long-term trend.
Mm-hmm.
So where do expectant mothers, so you were working primarily in Hamilton, Ontario for your research, correct?
Yes.
So thinking to that experience and that research, where do expectant mothers seek nutritional information primarily? And did you see any differences between like subgroups or communities or like subcommunities?
Definitely. So for my master's study, we weren't trying to sample any particular population, so we basically put it out there that anyone could join. The study's actually still ongoing, so if there is anyone in Hamilton, I'm not involved with it anymore, but it's great. It's called Mothers to Babies. They're in the second or third phase of their research. So if anyone is pregnant listening to this, you can go onto their Facebook page and do it.
I'll link that in the show notes.
Awesome. Perfect. Um, so we definitely did see some trends. So we did find, interestingly, I thought this was kind of crazy, but we asked people where they got their nutritional information, and we asked them kind of where they went to ask questions. And a lot of them answered that they were getting their information and getting their questions answered from the web.
Mm.
And from friends and family and like people within their circle. Many did answer that like they were receiving information from their midwife or OB or family doctor, but the number one source of information was online, which is terrifying.
It is, and I like, it's so, like I remember being pregnant and it's so easy. Like I found using apps and stuff was the easiest, because you'd have so many questions that you couldn't like call your doctor at 11 p.m. and be like, what is this experience? So it's like, it's, right in your hands, and it's terrifying because if you stop to think about all the information that you could source there, that's not necessarily correct or geared to your experience.
Exactly. And that was where another aspect of my research, health literacy. It's kind of the idea that like you are capable of understanding your health or your illness, and also capable of understanding the material that you find. So going online and looking through all these different websites, like, are you capable of being able to discern what is a true and legitimate, like, scientific source, and what is like someone's blog talking about like their own philosophy on these things, right? Like, and some of these websites look so legit that you wouldn't know that it's not an actual like medical professional selling this information, right? So
Yeah.
a lot of people just don't have the skills or the experience to be able to filter through all that information and determine what was accurate or not. And that was something we asked too in kind of a qualitative way on the survey. And people basically answered like, well, if I found conflicting information, I just kind of went with the thing that made the most sense to me.
Right.
Or I went with the thing that I've heard before from someone else. So if I'm hearing it from multiple places, then that has to be the thing that's true. So how they deal with conflicting information, again, like
That's
they're kind of,
fascinating.
yeah. And again, if you have these questions, like you said, you can't call your doctor in the middle of the night, but what if you don't remember that question later when you actually are with your doctor or your midwife?
Yeah, and I think something that you kind of hinted at there too, like if you think about the beliefs that are held about pregnancy or during pregnancy between like within cultures, but also across cultures, there
Mhm.
are such strong feelings and sentiments, and that's like deeply rooted in experiential knowledge being translated between groups. So
Mhm.
if you think about that in relation to the information that is like uh, contrasting each other, then
Mhm.
you tie that in with like the strong experiential and cultural underpinnings, and you've got like a very particular way of thinking about the world.
Mhm. And that even comes into food too. So like the cultural aspects of pregnancy nutrition, like that is another thing that kind of gets in there too to kind of bring the food back into this conversation is exactly like like you said, that the kind of cultural influences determine the acceptability of different things, whether it's like the source of information or the food. And to get back to, I guess, the second part of your question, we did actually find, keep in mind, this was a small sample size. So, like, statistically, it's not like the strongest evidence,
Right.
but we did find relationships between um, income level, so income and education, and the types of sources that people were using. So we did find that people with higher education had a lot more self-efficacy. So they were the ones kind of going out and doing a lot of research, and were using websites that were probably a little more legitimate. Um, but also talking to their doctor, also talking to their nurse, also talking to their midwives, whereas people from kind of lower socioeconomic groups, so socioeconomic is kind of like a combination of a bunch of different factors to describe people's like education and income and housing and kind of their living situations. So people from lower socioeconomic classes were more likely to use the internet and more likely to use their friends and family as sources of information rather than actually seeking advice from a medical professional.
Right.
Um, so yeah, there were definitely differences in the sources where people were getting their information, which again definitely impacts their perception of what is healthy and what isn't healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. And did you find, particularly because there's such a large immigrant population in Hamilton, did you find that there were differences in terms of how cultural food practices shaped their reaction to healthy or unhealthy food guidelines?
In a small way. We didn't have a huge immigrant population respond to the survey. I think part of that was the fact that we were only able to have the survey in one language. I think that is actually
Mm.
different now. I think they have had it translated. But at the time, if you could only do the survey if you read and spoke enough English. But there definitely were differences in their responses, like not statistically, but just in the types of foods that they thought were acceptable during pregnancy. We asked them like, what foods should you be eating during pregnancy? What should foods should you be avoiding, and then why? So some of those are really interesting. So some foods I've never even heard of before, but yeah, different cultural reasons for why people should be eating certain things or avoiding certain things. And even in a few examples, like I can't remember exactly what the food was, but we actually had to Google it. And
Oh,
from
really?
like looking it up online, we found that there was like some prohibition for this culture when they're pregnant. But it was like as like a born and bred Canadian, like I would never have known that. So that was interesting. I wish I remembered what the food was, but I don't. Licorice was one I hadn't heard before, like actual like licorice root.
Oh, that's interesting. As like
Yeah,
a taboo?
other like I think as something that was like just unhealthy for you.
Okay.
I hadn't heard of it before, but someone else in our team had, so it obviously wasn't like horribly obscure. But yeah, things like that definitely like impact like whether or not you thought things were healthy. On that note, like one piece that we found really interesting was actually fish.
Mm.
Um, so they would say, okay, what should you be eating during pregnancy? And they'd say, well, fish because it's a healthy lean protein. But then for the section of what should you not be eating, they would also say fish because of mercury
Oh my
or just
gosh.
fish in general. So like
Interesting.
it was interesting because like they would say fish, and sometimes they would give an explanation and sometimes they wouldn't. And so it's like, do they actually know why you shouldn't be eating fish?
Mhm.
Are we, and by we I mean like Health Canada, are they doing enough of a good job actually explaining why these things are healthy or unhealthy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like I'm trying to remember because I went to like a nutritionist during pregnancy and I'm trying to remember like I remember there being a lot of visuals, which was nice, but I don't remember them spending too much time explaining why certain foods were unhealthy. Um, which, you know, you could easily just put like a little text box to quickly demonstrate. Although I don't know if that would even really do anything because there is, particularly when you're thinking about fish and mercury contamination, that's such a like nuanced sort of thing to break down.
Yeah, even I mean, I to be truly honest, like I don't even really know that much about like mercury in fish. Like I really don't. I don't know what fish contains mercury more than others. Like I don't know at what amounts of ingesting that fish it becomes toxic. Like, I don't know. So like I don't think that's something the average person would like really think about or even really know about.
Yeah, it's basically I think for me I ended up researching it because I had the access to resources, but I can't remember it, so I don't know how helpful my research was. But there were certain I think it was just like if a fish like if I knew that like a family friend was serving me salmon, you know, I'd look it up and be like, is that okay to eat relative to tuna or whatever like whatever fish you know is higher in mercury.
Hmm.
So it's also interesting in that sense where you're like kind of comparing it to like a known entity that has a high level or a higher risk of contamination, and then kind of putting it in relation to that.
Yeah. So what is safe in relation to this thing that I know is not safe?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and kind of like working or creating your own knowledge based on that, which I don't know if I'd recommend that, but
No, but that's interesting too. Like from your own personal experience, like looking things up on the fly and kind of being like, oh, is salmon good?
yeah, exactly.
Like if you have like it's not something you just know,
Yeah, no, not at all.
but you like you said, you have the ability and the know-how to look that up for yourself, whereas like not a lot of people necessarily would.
No, or like even know where to begin kind of sifting through that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even I like overwhelming and I've never even had to deal with this sort of thing, but even I find like the kind of contradictions and the various kind of confusing pieces to this. Like I don't know, it is pretty overwhelming to like like learn this stuff probably like in a very short period of time during like a prenatal class, and then be able to be expected to like do it all properly and not like mess it up.
Yeah. And what's really interesting to me is like the amount of foods, like, I guess it's kind of a two-parter, but first is what you're not allowed to eat versus the cravings that you had. Like for me, I crave sushi, even though I knew that raw fish was not something that I could eat. And kind of on top of that, like when you order foods like that, you get policed by, like I found you get pretty policed by like servers or food industry people who see that you're pregnant, which is the kind of like a addition in our society of having that like not self-policing, but like communal policing of like pregnant bodies while they're eating food.
We could do an entirely extra episode of this podcast just on that. Like the whole like shame and blame on like women, like it's crazy. Like the minute you become pregnant, I don't think I've ever asked you this, but I mean, like the minute you become pregnant, it's like your body isn't yours anymore. Like, did you ever have just like people like walking up to you and like telling you what you should or shouldn't be doing, or like trying to touch your stomach? Like,
yes, always, like always. And it drives you absolutely nuts. And it doesn't stop. I mean, to be truthful, it continues when you're a mother. But I remember there was like, I ordered a smoothie once and I guess it had like vega protein in it. And I was told immediately by the bartender, and like, I'm thankful of that, but the person making it was like, oh, just so you know, there's like a label on the vega protein that says like pregnant women shouldn't consume this product. So you have those people kind of interjecting. And again, and sometimes it's good and sometimes it's like absolutely irritating, but yeah, it's very fascinating.
Because again, like, I mean, people also make choices in terms of their risks, right? Like maybe you go out for sushi because you're in your third trimester and you're tired of not having sushi, and so you make that risk assessment for yourself and you go and you have it, right? So
Yeah.
it's not even necessarily that like you are like making a mistake or like you're making an uninformed decision. Like people make informed decisions all the time to smoke when pregnant or have a glass of wine when pregnant, and so it's like who says that I get to police your actions when you have made that conscious decision?
Yeah, but it goes back to just thinking about like beliefs about particularly food, but generally like beliefs about pregnancy within any culture are very strong. Like it's black and white for a lot of people, which I also it's super fascinating.
Yeah, that is something I actually do want to learn more about, because I mean I'm in that realm still. So I wish I knew more about it, because what I do know is very interesting. But you're right, it is very culturally based. Like I only know my culture, and I need to learn more about other cultures and stuff. But yeah, it is really fascinating. Like some of the prohibitions and rules about like what you should or shouldn't do based on kind of what your heritage is.
Yeah, definitely. And then you get like different. I always use the example like in whenever I teach like food nutrition courses, like first foods for babies. And this is kind of off topic, but my partner is Polish, and so first foods were like apples and carrots and soft things like that, but like sweeter foods and tea. Whereas in Canada, I mean, it's changed now, I think, but at the time it was like potatoes and oats and like very starchy, bland foods versus like the sweet, soft like vegetables and produce. Okay, so going back to your research, in terms of, and we kind of talked about this a little bit, but what are some of the main barriers as a researcher to that you think people would have in terms of achieving these nutritional guidelines?
Ooh, I don't know what would be like number one or number two, but I would say the top two would definitely be like knowledge and finances. So
Yeah.
I think there's this myth that eating healthy is not that expensive, and that is very untrue. The inexpensive foods, like you can make a meal from canned goods for like an entire family for under $5, because canned beans and vegetables are like less than $1.
Yeah.
So even if they do know what they should or should not be eating, if they are financially insecure, if they have lots of children, if someone is out of work, if they're living off of Ontario Works, like they don't have a lot of money and food may not be a priority. Like maybe paying their rent is the priority or keeping their heat on, but if people are financially insecure, they're going to be food insecure, which
Yeah.
means that they are not going to be eating like 4 or 5 servings of fresh vegetables every day. They're going to be eating really calorie dense foods like beans and rice and pastas, where they get the most bang for their buck in terms of calories, because those things will keep them fuller longer, but isn't necessarily healthier for them.
And I guess too, it also lasts longer in terms of like preserving it and stretching it
Oh
out to
yeah,
other meals.
totally.
Yeah.
But yeah, the knowledge piece, like I mean, like I said before, I don't think the average person really knows what the Canada Food Guide says
Yeah.
for like a normal person, let alone a person who is pregnant. So I think knowing what's safe, what isn't, how much they should be eating, especially the whole eating for two thing. Like a lot of pregnant women like overeat in terms of calories because they
Hmm.
think they need more. Um, and it's not true. Like, I mean, if you're having twins, then yeah, you need to like up your caloric intake. But if you have a single baby, like you really don't need that much extra. But yeah, I think the knowledge or just like the understanding of these guidelines not being super clear or not being really digestible by the average person, I think makes it kind of difficult for people to really know what they should or shouldn't be doing. And so they kind of maybe just continue on with life as usual and don't really make any changes to their diets other than maybe having cravings every once in a while, and maybe they'll give into the cravings. But yeah, I think like having the money to actually buy healthy food and then knowing what the healthy food is are two of the biggest barriers that we found in our state.
It makes a lot of sense. And I think kind of within both of those is kind of that idea of like the luxury of time too. So you have, if you have the finances and you have the ability to seek out knowledge, you also probably have the time to do so. Whereas a lot of like lower socioeconomic families, especially if it's a mother 5 times over, wouldn't necessarily be able to sit down and like do the same food prep as a mother that can afford a nanny for her 2 children.
Exactly. We actually had a great quote from one of the participants where um, I believe she was pregnant with her second child. And so she said during her first pregnancy, she kept up her fitness routine and she was eating so healthy and she had a great pregnancy. And then with her second pregnancy, I think she was on mat leave, her husband was working, she had the toddler at home and she was pregnant with the second baby. And I obviously don't remember the quote verbatim, but it was basically like, I just gave up because my life was too crazy. I didn't have time. I was running after this baby. And I know what I should be eating and I know what I should be doing, but I just can't. And
Yeah.
I made that choice because I was stressing out, trying to have everything be perfect. And that was the thing that fell to the wayside. And I think that's so like important to remember is that like women often don't prioritize themselves, and in this instance like you're growing a baby inside of you, so it's not just your life, but you have all these again extra stressors outside of your own life that are kind of impacting your decisions. So this particular woman knew what she should be doing, like she knew what was healthy and she had done it very successfully for her first pregnancy, but for her second pregnancy like it just didn't work out with what was going on in her life.
Yeah, which like I don't blame her. I think most people in that situation would be very overwhelmed trying to deal with the balance of it all.
Like I think most people who know a mom like kind of see this going on, like you see these things happening, like you see that they're super overwhelmed and have like a million things going on because they're parents and they have to kind of just get things done. And it's
Exactly.
yeah, like I am not a parent, but I see my friends around me doing it, and every single time I see them and I'm just like completely in awe of the fact that they get everything done in a day that they do.
With my friends and I, like some of my mom friends and I, will send each other snaps, and it'll just be like us eating crackers over a sink because that's all we have time for. And like to me, that visual is exactly what motherhood is.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think that's like, it's funny, but at the same time, it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like, it's just so stressful to watch because I'm like, I want to help you somehow. Like,
Yeah. Oh, but that's how it goes. All right. So moving a little bit away from that, what are some of the ways in which more vulnerable populations that you discussed today can improve their nutritional knowledge? And kind of thinking a bit more broadly, not necessarily putting the onus on them, but how can researchers help to increase that ease of access for more vulnerable populations?
I think for sure, I guess the first thing I'm going to say is putting the onus on the people. But I mean, prenatal classes, and I know in Hamilton there's quite a few programs. There's one called Welcome Baby where
Mm,
they actually do like a really good job of actually educating them on like nutrition and food and what sizes look like and things like that. So I think that's something that people could do, is attend these free prenatal classes and try and learn as much as they can there and ask questions. What I think the healthcare system or researchers can do is try and make their findings more digestible by normal people. And by normal people, I mean people who don't necessarily like understand the overly complicated like medical jargon. So
yeah.
put it in words that like your average person can understand. So I think the reading level, I think for like the government, like whenever they release something, I think they try and make it like at a reading level of like an eighth grader or something. Um, but that way, like it reaches everyone. So even if you have someone who has very little education, like theoretically, that is much more accessible to them than something that is a lot more academic in nature. So I think just like translating it into something people can understand. But um, I think part of that too is I think that midwives, OBs, family doctors, family health nurses, like wherever people are getting their prenatal care, I think nutritional guidelines and like more counseling on gestational weight gain needs to happen like there.
Like for the midwives and the OBs and stuff like that, or for.
From the caregiver to the pregnant person.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
It's not, they don't really have a lot of time during the appointment to address those types of things. Um, and like in the literature, it's not something that they even feel comfortable addressing because, um, I mean, general practitioners, OBs, midwives, they don't have degrees in nutrition, right? Like it's not, it's part of their education, but it's not something that they're necessarily experts in.
Right.
So I think if they address it maybe at that level, that will help too. Um, but I don't know. Like I'm trying to think of like other knowledge translation things that they could do. So like posters or like pamphlets or take homes, and those probably already exist. But I don't know. Just maybe making it like more user friendly on the website. Like it's not super pretty. Like if you go onto their website right now, it's not great. So maybe if they just kind of made it super clear with very clear cut um, explanations for things, that would help. But yeah, it is hard because if people are going online, it's almost like you feel like you should go online, but I don't know how you would reach them any better than like some random online doctor's website.
Yeah, that's fair. That's actually a really good point. Like, do you kind of compete within it, or do you compete in an alternative way to get the information out there?
Yeah, so I think that's maybe why like if the practitioners are dealing with it directly, if the prenatal classes and the prenatal programs are dealing with it directly, at least that way it's like face to face. They have the opportunity to ask questions. Like you can hand them the pamphlets if they don't end up reading them, like at least they have them.
Yeah.
um but yeah, I think like maybe like person to person engagement is maybe the way to do it, but I don't know. I think that's one of those things where they just kind of have to try various things and see what works. And I just hope that I don't know. I hope that they are trying. I know that like the prenatal classes in Hamilton that I attended as part of the study, they seemed great. So whatever they're doing seems to be working really well because they always have really high turnout.
Awesome. And like putting a face to these sorts of questions and answers, absolutely, particularly for pregnant women that are kind of like intimidated by the whole process, having that face-to-face interaction, I'm sure does wonders.
And even if they're too afraid to ask a question, maybe if someone else asked the question that they also had, then they know the answer now. So it's kind of like a group.
Yeah, like a community building.
Mhm.
Nice. Okay, so kind of keeping in line with that as we wind down, do you have any resources, be it books or journal articles or news articles that have come out that you would recommend for people who are interested in learning more about food guidelines during pregnancy or, I guess, like knowledge translation and access to nutritional knowledge in pregnancy?
Ooh, that's a good one. I guess for lack of other options, I would still recommend like the Health Canada website. It's kind of clunky, it's not pretty, but all the information is there at some point. Like you kind of
Yeah.
have to look for it, but I would definitely use that. Um, I don't know in terms of other cities, but look at your local public health agency. I know in Hamilton, like if you go onto their public health website, like they have a lot of information on there. So even just like checking locally to see if there's like local materials as opposed to just like the government of Canada or the government of Ontario kind
Right.
of um, produce materials. In terms of articles, off the top of my head, no, but I could get you a list of some recent journal articles, particularly the ones on like gestation awaken. I think are interesting.
Cool. Yeah.
Um, yeah, but I don't have any off the top of my head. I wish I did, but yeah, I think just maybe staying off the internet's a good idea.
Fair. No Yahoo answers.
Don't get your health advice from Facebook. Like, just
Oh,
stay away
yeah.
from like the Facebook groups because you never know. You just never know who these people are or like what they're saying, and just yeah,
That's good advice.
that's what I would say at least.
Stay off Facebook. No, also, I would say like no late night Google searches because that never ends
Yes,
well for anyone.
yes, and try to stay away from WebMD. Don't do that to yourself because you're just gonna go down a rabbit hole.
Yep, for sure. All right. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, me too. This was wonderful.
That was Lindsay Grenier, a research assistant at McMaster University studying maternal and prenatal health and nutrition. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed today, I've linked some resources that she's kindly provided in my show notes and on my website, anthropology.com. If you love what you're hearing, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever you're listening and consider leaving a rating and review on iTunes. You can also find us at our website, anthropology.com, on Facebook by searching for the Anthropology Podcast, or on Instagram at SinSarahD or at Anthropology Podcast. Because I still haven't decided if I want to do a singular page for this or if I want to separate my real life from my podcast life. Let me know. What should I do there? Thanks so much for listening. We will see you next time.